Kentucky University, and I'm so thankful that the School of the Arts at NKU is allowing me to continue this conversations with Kevin. And I have a great guest with us today, Emily Ann Cartledge, who
Well,
has been a printmaker and a librarian for quite some time. Her work is in collections in Vietnam, as well as all different parts of the United States, and has shown extensively in the United States. So, Emily Ann, welcome.
thank you. It's nice to be here. Thank you, Kevin.
Could you tell us about what you're doing currently when you're not printmaking?
So I am a librarian at Smith College. I work in a unit called the Imaging Center, which is part of the art department, and we were originally digitizing images for art historians to teach in class. We sort of expanded our scope into teaching digital skills to artists and art historians. We do some things across campus, 3D imaging, as well as, showing folks how to make their own digital collections, stuff like that. So I'm now the director of the Imaging Center. So most days I am on the Smith campus, helping students and faculty out with whatever they need to either realize their work or realize their art historical pursuits.
Mhm. And Emily Ann, I know that your undergraduate degree is in anthropology
Mhm.
or anthropology, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And you have quite an extensive um, knowledge of art history and of art. Could you tell us how you got involved with becoming an artist?
Sure. So I think I was where I grew up, where actually both me and my wife grew up, and it was a fairly rural-ish part of Ohio. So there wasn't a lot of visual art education. So I think like a lot of people, I drew at home. I had action figures and Legos that I would create worlds with. I did some amateur theater, and I didn't really, and then was in theater tech crew in high school, but I didn't really start pursuing the visual arts until the end of my high school career. I took a drawing course during my lunch period, the last semester of my senior year, and kind of fell in love then. And then so once I got to undergrad, I pretty quickly signed up for a studio minor, and then pursued that along with anthropology. And then from there, I did some post-bac work um, to sort of uh, fill out my lack of knowledge, and then went to grad school for printmaking.
Mhm. And that's where we met
Yep.
in graduate school. And I
Mhm.
was always blown away by the quality of your printmaking and the drawing that you would incorporate into these scenes. And um, what were some of your inspirations then, and what are some of your artistic inspirations now?
Hmm. Well, let's see. I think well, there was a few things. So when I was in undergrad and then post grad, I was still looking at a lot of the sort of canonical people. So someone like Jasper Johns was really important because he was kind of making these kind of wild built works that were really about thought rather than like expression of emotion. So it was sort of like kind of gave permission for a lot of um, overthinking introverts to make art, which was great. And I paid and still do, if I'm in an art museum, I'll look and see if they have a Jasper Johns work and look at it. Laurie Anderson was another big person because she was kind of someone that I really first understood that what art could be about, opposed from just like, looking at a tree and drawing a tree, which has its own depth to it that I didn't realize when I was younger. Um, and so I think sort of her vignette storytelling with imagery was something certainly that I had in mind when I was making my works in grad school. And then I was looking back at a lot of the children's illustrators that were important to me as a kid. Um, Edward Gorey was one who I still look at year after year. His house is on Cape Cod, and it's a lovely house museum. So I try to go every year to view works and I keep learning more from him. But he was a big influence. Um, I remember at the time I did a ton of research on Beatrix Potter because I was working with rabbit.
Rabbits.
Yeah, I was working with rabbit imagery, so I was like, well, then I need to know everything about Beatrix Potter, who is actually a fascinating individual. Um, so I think there was sort of this, yeah, this mix of illustrators and contemporary artists that I was looking at and sort of mixing that together, and I think that's still the case.
Hmm. Yeah, so, like when you say Beatrix Potter, I see the quality of draftsmanship or draftspersonship in her work, and I find a similar quality in yours as well in terms of the rendering of some of the rabbits and even the positioning. I one of my, I mean, we were in the Cotswolds, or is it we were in the Lake District
Okay, yeah.
for a little bit where she had her house and studio, and unfortunately we didn't get a chance to see it because we had so many other things to do and we were just in the Lake District for a weekend. So, but it's like if I do go back, I will go there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and she was one of the first. There was Anne Greenaway was a little bit in earlier in the 19th century. Um, was maybe the first woman children's illustrator to really make her name, but Beatrix Potter is like the close second. Interestingly, both of them had ties to the pre-Raphaelite movement. And as a child, I forget which pre-Raphaelite painter, but one of them taught Beatrix Potter how to draw. So, um,
Yeah. Could we all have
I know.
pre-Raphaelites teaching us how to
Yeah.
draw? Please.
Yes, come to our house
Yeah.
and
Yeah, we'll set you up at the kitchen table, and I'll be doing my little watercolors, and you can give me some drawing instruction. So I always ask people this question as well. Do you have some quotes that govern your life, or some quotes that are really inspirational to you?
there's a quote that I think to myself all the time when I'm working in the studio, and uh, the animator and director Brad Bird, who did The Incredibles, and before that he did his insanely made his own animated movie outside of the studios called, I think it was The Iron Giant. So because he came from this under-resourced background to Pixar, he apparently had this indigenous American saying put up on the wall, like I think at the entrance, saying use every part of the buffalo. And what he meant by that for them was that because animation is such a resource intensive, especially in time, but also money endeavor, if you have to cut a scene, that's probably a lot of work that you've lost. And he was very stringent about any character design or background or cutscene, finding of ways to reuse it within the film so that every corner is filled with something. And I think about that a lot in my own work because I work full time. I have to kind of really think about finding old sketches and reusing them for parts to construct full images that become prints. Um, there was a time I remember one of the first times that I did this was like in 2002 or three. Um, I was working on these rabbit portrait heads, and I had the head that I had drawn recently, but then I pulled a sketch from life of a sport coat and hat, and then started like putting it together in Photoshop to sort of get the angle right. And then that became, once that was printed out, that was traced for the working drawing. And so I'm often doing those kinds of things where I'm pulling bits of sketches to build the final image.
Yeah, like you use it as an armature and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And
Exactly.
mhm,
Yeah.
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 Mhm, yeah.
So, and that way things just don't, I mean, I think especially early on, you kind of think, well, I did this thing and say maybe it didn't work out particularly well as far as the work goes. And then you're just like, well, then I'm done with it and move on. Or you half work on something and say, well, I have to return to this at some point. And maybe you never do. But that doesn't mean that they just need to sit in the drawer.
Mhm.
They can be reused for other things. So thinking creatively about your creative output is something that I have to think about all the time. So,
Yeah. It's like anytime you're working, and in a way, you're also sort of like stockpiling all of the time that you're spending working on something, even if
mhm.
the results might not be immediate, you might be able to kind of pull those out of the flat file or
Yeah.
off the computer and be able to kind of get right back into it at a different time or use it on a slightly different project. So it's like you're making use of every minute. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. I think the singer Tom Waits once said that he uses unfinished songs as cut bait to hook
Ah.
songs. So the same kind of
Mhm. Yeah. And sometimes like you're really into music and
oh yeah.
uh like sometimes you'll just be listening to a band and you'll hear, man, that riff really sounds similar to this other riff that they have, but they just change
Mhm.
one or two chords or slow it down. It's like you only have so much time to be creative and you want to try to make sure that all of that time is used to its fullest potential.
Yeah.
hmm Yeah. And in terms of, we've talked a little bit about music. Who are some of your favorite musicians or the types of music you listen to? And we can take that also into authors. Are there some
Sure.
um,
Well,
writers that you like?
most of my reading nowadays is in the sciences, looking for topics for my work. And I bumped around for a bit, and then sort of landed on Science News as like a very good, concise description of what's happening in the sciences. And then I can use that to, as a librarian, find articles and things. I'm reading that pretty religiously.
And
Um,
that's fact-based, right?
hmm,
That's fact-based, right?
it is fact based, or so they say, or so they would have you believe. So that's but that is something that I return to a lot, and I do end up reading a lot of scientific papers. But as far as on the flip side, I've been reading a lot of graphic novels and manga lately. So I'm trying to think who. Oh, I have to think of the name of the. I can probably pull it up. There's a manga that I've been reading, and because the drawing is so good, it's called Witch Hat Atelier, and it's sort of like it's very much like a child who studies to be a wizard kind of a thing. But the sort of the basis of it is that wizards do magic by writing. So they actually write the spell out or write symbols out, and that actually creates the spell. And they don't tell normal people how they do it, and their general um, function in life is to create magical things to help other people out. So there's like a lot of like really interesting design thinking discussions that
hmm
happen in this, and they're to the point where I'm like, I have to show our design thinking professor this, like where these two 11-year-old children are talking about the different magical ways that we could help someone who doesn't have use of their legs and what would work and what wouldn't. And it was sort of that and just the drawing itself, which is amazing. I've been reading that a bit. Let's see, music wise, I go in circles all the time. So currently, I think I'm listening to a lot of 80s goth. Um, because I love it so.
Like
A lot-
Susie and the Banshees,
yeah, Susie and the
or
Banshees, a lot of 4AD stuff like Dead Can Dance or the Cocteau Twins. Um, I was listening to a lot of that last couple of months. Um, some some ambient techno. There's an early Aphex Twin album called Ambient Works Volume 2 that they re-released, but it's great background work music in the studio. And I like listened to it pr pretty regularly for, 30 years. So there's some of that, but then yeah, there have been times when I'm into more folk stuff like Tom Waits or Suzanne Vega or Kate Rusby, or Hem. I did have a big uh, Bach phase a couple years ago. So I was listening to a lot of string works by Bach. Um, and there was during the pandemic, I discovered a guitarist who recorded under the name the Durutti Column. And he was part of the factory group of like New Order and that group of people, but he just did
Mhm.
beautiful, often instrumental guitar pieces that were just lovely. So there, I had sort of a not too long ago big phase with him, but
Mhm.
let's go around. But I think anything on there was a recent death metal interest, but um,
Death metal?
a little, yeah. There's a great, uh, I guess it was there's sort of shoegaze slash black metal influenced artist. Actually, I think I have it here. What's her name?
Mhm.
Oh yeah, Svalbard. Well, I think it's and the woman who leads it is just terrific. So I was listening to some of that, but I
Mhm.
anything that for me in a sort of opposite to the reason that I would look at someone like Jasper Johns, anything that does sort of evoke a mood, and in a lot of some cases is contemplative in some way, is something that I try to seek out because when I'm in the studio or in the car, that's sort of often what I need. Although when I'm actually production printing, then something like death metal and punk will keep me going. So,
Okay. So when you are running things through the press, it's punk and death metal.
yeah,
When you're in the studio drawing on the plates, it's Cocteau Twins and other
mhm,
things that are kind of ambient and okay.
absolutely. Yeah,
All
that's
right.
pretty much it.
Yeah, we need to know the secrets. Unlike those little magicians that are running around casting spells,
I
you're telling us all your magical
know
secrets.
all my secrets. Yes.
Mhm. So let's take a look at some of your work. See, zoom out.
Oh,
Can you see it?
I can.
All
Yes.
right. Could you talk about this piece?
Sure. So this is a piece that I did. This was my not the latest show, but the show right before that. Um, there is a place at the center in the center of Massachusetts called Harvard Forest because Harvard owns a forest where they do ecological research. But they have a really amazing archive of all the research that's done there. And unlike some other spots at Harvard, it's easy for me to get to because I'm in the western half of Massachusetts. And they were perfectly fine with me just rolling in and looking at all their research. So I had picked three different research projects that happened. One was the 1920s, I think. This was the 1950s, and then there was one that was in the 1970s. So this study was about whether or not seed size would determine the health of pine trees in the future. And the reason I was kind of drawn to the study is that in 1950s style, not only did was everybody wearing a lab coat in all the photographs, um, which is not what happens now, but they had kind of built this crazy machine that this rabbit is using to actually sort the seeds into different sizes. It had like some sort of turbine in it. It was absolutely amazing. Um, so this is sort of a recreation of that and sort of the start or the kind of the key image for, there are a couple of other prints that talked about the research itself. Um, but it also, and then it features the different locations where these pine seeds were pulled from, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York. Um, with this piece, this set, I tried to throw as many different techniques as I possibly could. Um, so there's relief, there's the text is in litho, the plate is let's dry point and roulette, and then hand tinting, and there's also I think a collagraph plate with for the white on toned paper. And I was also kind of experimenting with cutting the plate itself. Um, both to sort of like change how it formats on the paper itself, but also there's sort of this idea that when you're doing scientific research, you don't ultimately have the full, the full picture like you would in your standard painting. Like there's still bits that are missing. And so I kind of wanted to maybe reflect that a little bit visually. Um, this show was really hard to do.
Yeah.
And technically it was sort of difficult. And as a matter of fact, after I showed it the first time, I went back and reworked all the plates, changed all the inkings, um, which ultimately worked out because this print and one of the others ended up getting into a couple of different shows. But um, it's never too late to completely redo something that you've worked on.
So would this be your most complicated print that you've ever worked on in terms of combining all of the different types of printmaking and cutting the plate and
I would say yes, that I printed myself. Now I have, I think a print that we'll look at a little bit later, which is very large and also has some sheen collé in it. I actually worked with a good friend of mine who's a master, is a litho master printer. So she actually, I did the sheen collé parts, and then she actually did the heavy lifting on the printing itself. So that was also really complicated, but I think this was like, yeah, yes,
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Let me stop sharing and we'll see what the next image I can pull up will be. Let's see here. Um, and all right, let's talk about this one.
sure.
Go ahead.
Um, so the one that is highlight right now, um, can you see the full image, Kevin?
Yeah. And
Okay,
you
great.
can see it too. There's a
I can see
helicopter.
that I can see the thumbnail, which is all I need. Um,
Okay.
uh, as long as it's the one with the orange background. That's it.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect.
It's the helicopter bringing in a rock, and there's
Yes.
in the
So,
foreground, it looks like there's someone, looks like some excavation happening, moving buckets, and looks like a archaeological site.
so this is the landscape is part of a national park in western Nebraska. That is it's the Agate Fossil National Monument. And they've done a lot of fossil excavation, sort of post dinosaur, but not quite to like Ice Age. So sort of in between that area. Uh, and so that landscape was something I did quite a bit of drawing while I was out there. And this piece is for my latest group of work, in which I was sort of following the thought lives and work lives of a couple of paleontologists who work in a fictional museum in my head. And they're based on a couple of friends of mine who are librarians that I had worked with in the past. Uh, so this one, and so I'd sort of picked uh, different locations where each person worked and different fossilized animals that they worked on. So this character who's kind of holding the measuring stick in the foreground and leading the dig. That's based on a friend of mine, Caitlin Pereira, who works at Mass College of Art. And this is the name of the character is Abby, and she works primarily with a kind of an early loon that was sort of a diving bird. It was kind of a cross between a loon and a penguin, but it had teeth. So there are several images of her working in the lab on this particular animal. But I also wanted to have a large print for each person, for each character, showing them in the field, because field work is, a really big part of that. So so yeah, so it's a three color lithograph, and then the helicopter that is lifting out the large fossils is a Shinkolei piece. So this is the piece that I had mentioned, that the two large pieces for this particular show, I worked with Carolyn, a friend of mine who's a printer, to actually get these printed because they're so large, and the Sheen Calais it was done before the actual printing happened. You really have to be very practiced to get it right where it needs to be. Um, so so I put
Ah,
my work in my trust in the hands of a master printer for this particular piece.
Now, how big is this?
That is, let me look it up real quick. I can give you the exact measurement. It is 34 by 24 inches.
Yeah, that's big for
Yeah.
printing.
It's big for a print, and it's not even it's larger than like the standard sheet size that you would get for most printmaking papers is 20 by 30. So I had to get sort of like double-sized papers to print this and the other piece that goes with it. So yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
cool. All right, we'll go on to the next one.
and this is one of the first published papers by Stephen Jay Gould, the science writer. Uh, and what he was doing was looking at two different species of snail in a Caribbean island, which, nice work if you can get it, um, that had evolved to have the same shell shape and size, but were clearly, like, if you looked at the soft parts of the snail, you would know that they're completely different species. And he worked with a mathematician and sort of figured out that, initially one of the snails had been larger, and because it was on an island and therefore easy to spot by birds and that kind of thing, it over time evolved a smaller shell. And mathematically, the only way to make that shell smaller was to do it in the shape of this other snail. And so that was sort of a kind of showing a coevolutionary maxim that he was pointing out. So, in order to figure out how to turn this into an image, I actually spent a decent amount of time. This is when we lived in Boston, going to the Harvard Natural History Museum. Um, and because we were members, there were sort of backstage tours and this kind of thing. So I actually had photographs of a lot of these places where, they would have shelves and shelves and shelves of snail shells, or things in jars and this kind of thing. So it was sort of an early way for me to kind of figure out how to show this work in action, um, and sort of put it in a particular place. So I think each of these is sort of illustrative in sort of like a very traditional way, in that it's like a particular scene that can be read as some event that's going on. And I ended up doing different things later on, but yeah, this was sort of, I think, the first really successful attempt that I had. So this print means a lot to me, and I think it was also a fairly early litho of mine, because mostly up until that point I had worked in etching and screen print. So it was also a decent technique wise, a pretty decent litho. So
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Thanks for sharing this with us. let's go back to full screen images of ourselves,
That sounds good.
and then
Mm.
I have a question for you once we are no longer like once we're faces are big again. Big face.
Uh, that sounds like an album title. When Our Faces Are Big Again.
So are you still, let's see, are you still sharing it? Because our
Oh,
faces
that's
are
right. Oh,
so
sorry. Oh, yeah.
small.
Sorry about
Yeah.
that. I'll just stop the share.
Okay.
That's right. It's
All
open.
right.
There we go.
Yeah. So here's a question for you. You've been using rabbits in your artwork
Mhm.
for at least since the late 90s.
Yes,
Um,
around 98. Well, 97. So,
yeah. So sometimes my students are like, I want to paint a rabbit, or I want to paint a duck, or I want to paint a dog. What recommendations might you give students or artists that want to use an animal in their work, and how can that animal become interesting to someone that's not necessarily interested in
right.
rabbits per se?
Well, it depends on, well, actually, it kind of doesn't depend. So if you're, so I'm doing something, figures that are anthropomorphic. They're sort of like human figures, and which is very much on purpose because I do think of it as, the fact that, you know, hairless monkeys are doing science is pretty weird. And um, it's equally,
Might that be?
yeah. So it's equally weird that, if you had, say, a different species doing it, and the idea that, an animal can then sort of like experiment and understand the world that they live in. So I think there's sort of reasoning behind my use of this, which has evolved over time, because I was certainly more interested in more cartoon aspects and the kind of general, like mining the kind of cuteness of rabbits in my early work. But I think one of the first things that I would do is find either in a natural history museum stuffed or in your yard or your house, find an actual dog or rabbit or bird, and draw from life. Because I think one of the things that can happen, and it certainly happened to me plenty of times, is that you kind of, especially if you're working in more of like an illustrative or cartoon style, you kind of fall into the style of someone else that you've seen a lot and the way that they're doing that. And I think you'll find more interesting possibilities if you start in a way from scratch and sort of see how that's going to develop over time. And I think that was certainly my case. I have a lot of photos of rabbits and hares on my iPad. I've been to a bunch of different natural history museums and drawn from stuffed rabbits from in DC and in Boston and a few other areas, I think. Um, and that sort of investigation can help. Um, and I think it's also not a bad idea, and this might seem contradictory, but also to look at how a variety of different artists have approached that particular animal. Um, because there are, certainly particular ways of depicting rabbits that I kind of preferred, but I started to look at, someone like, say, Arthur Rackham, who has a very different style than, say, mine. Or I'm trying to think who else, medieval reproductions, all sorts of things like that. So both, I would say, work from life to sort of develop your own um, vocabulary about depicting this animal, but also look at some pretty wildly disparate stuff just to sort of know how far, think about how far you could go. That would be my.
Mhm. Yeah, I love those ideas because it's like if you want to get real, if you want to do a realistic rabbit, well, we have Durr. We have
Yeah.
Durr's
Oh yeah,
rabbit.
for
Okay.
sure.
So there's that,
Yeah. That's like the ultimate rabbit in Western art.
yeah, for realistic drawing of a rabbit. And then like yeah, but knowing all the different ways that one might be able to depict a rabbit, I think is a good way to then eventually figure out where you stand.
Yeah.
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 Good. One question I like to ask a lot of my guests is in terms of who would you like to thank? Who are some people that have inspired you or have given you confidence and who like this is your time to send out a few shout outs.
My few shout outs. So in high school, probably the biggest person was our theater professor, Michelle Mascarai, who retired a few years ago. Um, and and that's sort of, I did tech crew for 4 years, and that's kind of where, even though it's a different art form, the responsibilities and the knowing how to work is sort of that's where you develop those things. And I think with Michelle, that was definitely the case for a lot of students, not just me. And some of them have gone on to like choreograph on Broadway and all sorts of things. So her skills are tremendous as far as um, getting high school students to sort of create a work habit to what it takes to create artwork. And then I had mentioned that I had taken a drawing class my last semester, and that was with a teacher. I think his name was Mr. O'Brien, and he agreed to let me just sit in on the course because I'd missed the actual sign up. And then when he saw that I was serious, I remember him sitting and going, "Yeah, you want to just quit this sitting in thing and I'll just put you in the class for a grade."
Uh-huh.
And that, that was that kind of permission and positive help was meant a lot. Um, in college, I had a few different professors who were very strong on technique, but I think there were other students who probably meant more to me. Um, uh, let's see. There's Melody Serenity, who's a painter in Chicago now. And she was really one of the first people who sort of like, even though she was a BFA student, she really took me in and encouraged me as an artist. I had another friend named Cami Climaco, who is a ceramicist in New York City, and we kind of shared the same sort of bizarre Fluxus inspired sense of art. And so I think that was, this person that I could share those kinds of ideas with. Um, and then finally, there was a printmaker named Jill McGar who she was, I think, a year or two above me and was making beautiful prints. We had similar interest in music and similar interest in sort of an ethereal style in printmaking. And so she was also somebody who sort of welcomed me in, despite the fact that I was just a studio minor. And I think all three of them were, I still think about the things that they do today. And as a matter of fact, I still have some of their work hanging on my walls. And then finally, I know it's been a long list, and the orchestra will start kicking up.
It should be a long list.
Yeah,
I
it
hope
should.
that
That's
we all
true.
live in a world where it's hard to be able to thank everyone because I hope that we're, as human beings, we're trying to help people all the time. And after
That's true.
a life of making art or a life of doing anything, I hope that there's a whole long list of people that we can always thank.
Yeah, I mean, the printer I mentioned, Carolyn Muscat, is a very good friend of mine and has been. She's one of the people I think as an artist, especially once you're outside of school, you're really looking for people to be able to talk about art with and talk about each other's work. And I think Carolyn is one of those people that I do we'll text each other work back and forth all the time. And I have another
Mhm.
friend from grad school, Dan Glubizzi, who lives out in Portland, and we're doing the same thing. Or, every couple weeks we'll talk on the phone. He'll tell me all the stuff that he's reading and what his work kind of work he's working on. So I think cultivating those friendships after school is really important. But then the last person I would definitely want to mention is my grad thesis advisor, Jim Williams, who was an incredible advisor. And he was one of those people who could critique your work. And it wasn't like I think there's you get a sense sometimes, and often just it's your own insecurities as, say, an undergraduate that, either you're an artist or you're not. And like all of that is on the line during a critique. But Jim was very good at saying, this is problem solving. And if there's an issue here, what are the multiple ways that you can approach solving this problem? And then you become sort of a fellow problem solver. And that is something that I still carry with me. And that's why I would redo a whole show of Prince, because I kind of approached it as, okay, if there's a problem here, what are the things that would change that to make it work? And
Yeah.
that's just so important as an artist and as a librarian, even that uh,
Mhm.
it's something I use all the time.
Yeah. A big shout out to all those people in printmaking.
Oh yeah,
Um, Jim and Don,
yeah, Don
those
Kelly.
guys really, they kept the ship going and they did it in a way where I learned a lot about just how to be collegial. And I shouldn't
Yeah,
even say that because those guys, they were friends, and they
word.
respected each other's areas and spaces and knew that the best thing for everyone was if everyone kind of worked together and got along. And when I would be doing my really crappy prints up there with you guys, like they were all really positive and
Mhm.
really kind of like, yeah, let's all do this together. Let's figure this out.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They
hmm
were both incredible. I know that Don just passed away. Which
hmm
huge loss for the Cincinnati area and just printmaking in general. Um, and of course, I think we would be both remiss if we didn't mention Patrick Mock, a mutual.
Mockster.
Yes.
Yeah. hmm
He was a fellow printmaker. I think we all hung out together quite a bit, but he's another person that was and is great to talk about art with. And yeah, I think we all spent a lot of late nights together
Yeah.
getting work
hmm
done because we were young enough that we could pull that off. And
hmm The good
had that
old
not
days.
affect us
Yeah.
much. Um,
Right. Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I think, I guess sort of in sum, there are there are teachers who can really give you sort of a lifelong set of tools to use as an artist. And then there are, friends and compatriots who kind of help bring you along, and then you end up still needing that after going to school, because it's a lifelong development.
Yeah. And like to think about when I would come up and visit you guys in the printmaking studios and when I was working on prints, like I saw you as the technician. I
Yeah.
saw Patrick as this guy that was like, man, I just want to do this. I'm gonna make some prints and like I'm gonna make
Yes.
like the person that's just gonna go all in on something. And then Jim and Don, I felt they were like these like sages of martial arts, and they were kind of like giving off these like this Zen, like
Hmm.
everything's gonna be good, everything's gonna be okay, and then like Andy Awe,
Oh yeah, indeed.
I felt like his work was coming from a place where it was like holy mackerel, this is a whole nother language and it's crazy and exciting, and whatever you are doing, you are speaking your own language, and
Mhm.
like just keep doing it. Like, yeah.
Which
Hmm.
he has. His work is fantastic. I run into his work every once in a while in printmaking circles, and it's still.
Yeah, it's still great. Yeah. Hmm. Like I would say both of you guys um uh, really worked in a way where you found your own voice
Mhm.
and you continued to make work that's very exciting. And like Emily Ann, you have your rabbits. The rabbits have been going
Yeah,
forever, and you've been telling stories. And then Andy's work, it's like they're blueprints from like outer space describing different types of aliens,
yeah.
and like those things are still being transmitted and beamed to Earth.
Right.
And
That's a good way. I like that. That's fantastic. Yeah.
it's not gonna stop.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Mhm.
And
All
until
right.
we build whatever it is that they're beaming to us.
Yep. Hmm. Yeah. So I guess are there any other things you'd like to say or talk about?
Let's see. Um, oh, I do have a couple of favorite things if you wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, not
My
at all.
favorite part of this. It's
Oh,
like
okay.
Oprah's favorite thing too. Like,
Oh.
show us some of your favorite things. Yeah.
Well, I have a couple books and a couple tools.
Oh,
So
great.
I'll start with the tools. So I tend to work on toned paper, which means I'm doing a lot of highlighting, and I have this Cretacolor um, chalk holder that I use all the time. So much so that, like, I'm sure many artists, I bought several of these, which I keep in like a stash in my closet in case they stop making them for some reason.
Hmm.
Because it really the design really fits my hand really nicely. And the white chalk that they use really stands out on a toned page. So I love this thing. Keep this around all the time. S-
Product endorsement.
Yes.
What is it again?
What is this? The Cretacolor Ecologic.
Right there from
There you
Emily
go.
Ann. This stuff is it's a good tool.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
There we go. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we don't
Um,
want to have a shortage on those.
we
Okay.
don't. That is absolutely the case. I'm also a big fan of retractable erasers because I do like to use it in the way that you would use a drawing tool to erase out parts as if it was its own mark. So as you can see, this one is almost out of eraser. So that gets a lot of use. And then a little history lesson. The printmaking professor that I had in undergrad was, among many things, like really into tools and tool care. And so he had us all buy a brush to put hard ground on. He's like, well, if you take care of that brush, it'll never go bad. And so, quite diligently, I took care of this brush that I bought in 1994. And it is, as promised, it is still, it has not fallen apart. It is still in good shape. Uh, Clean it with solvents first, and then usually some liquid soap after that. So it works.
Taking care of the tools.
Taking
Hmm.
care of the tools. And then I have a couple books. The first one is a book from childhood that I had found when we were moving, and realized I was like, oh, this was definitely seminal. This has been hiding in my brain forever. So it's a uh, Where Everyday Things Come From by Aldrin Watson, who turns out is also a printmaker. But it's things like, how paper is made, but these animals are shown like doing all the technical work. And I was like, oh, that this has been living in my brain forever. Um,
And there is this probably like this like, oh man, like because I remember in graduate school, I had this idea. I started doing several photos from where my position was, and then I'd collage all these photos together, and then I'd make a
Hmm.
painting from it. I was like, I'm a genius. This is my thing. And then that summer, I went to the National Gallery and I saw that David Hockney had already beat me to it. I'm like,
Oh yeah.
dang.
Yeah. I have often said I was like, if I was really, I not that I don't want my work to be original, but I'm like, if I was worried about like having to be the most original, drawing rabbits is the worst way to do that. So, um, but yeah, so there's actually like, this is a rabbit at a textile machine.
Oh.
Totally amazing. Anyway, so that's that book, and I think both my love of procedurals and animals doing things. Um, this is a book that one of my anthropology teachers had recommended to me, and when I started doing prints about biology and natural history, um, this it's basically a history book called Science is the Way of Knowing. And I think most like if you read any like popular histories of science, probably they're using this as one of its source materials. So that's a really fantastic book. And then finally, there's sort of like there's art that inspires you because it's like your work, and then there's art that inspires you just because you like it.
Hmm.
So this is the catalog from the Royal Art Lodge. It was sort of a collective drawing crew in Winnipeg. They showed at the Drawing Center in New York, and they're doing these kind of like, let me see if I can find a good. So Marcel Zama is one of the artists who came out of this group. Um, and they're doing these kind of like crazy childlike drawings with the text,
Oh.
think of all the adventures they've had. And then at the end, like at the end of each drawing session, the five of them would decide whether it would go in the star suitcase, the OK suitcase, or the suitcase to be burned. And that was just sort of how uh, that was their operation. And there was so many days um, when I was living in Boston where I would just ride the subway and just page through this to like, just keep me going. It was sort of that
Hmm.
kind of work. And weirdly, strangely enough, I had for a while Marcel Zama, the artist, was making action figures that he was selling in stores in New York. Of it was like the mythology of Winnipeg, but it looked like Star Wars action figures, like it had the same font and everything. And I had bought one, and I was when I was starting my transition, I actually went through a lot of things that collectible things that I owned and sold them back to assist with that. Which was therapeutic in a lot of ways. So I had this action figure and I was like, well, it's not worth much, but I'll just put it on eBay. So someone bought it, and then I print out the address, and it's Marcel Zama is buying all of these back, and he lives in upstate New York.
Oh, wow. Were you able to then send a letter and
That's exactly, I was like, I'm sorry that I'm getting rid of this. I'm transitioning, so I'm, getting rid of a bunch of things, and but your Royal Art Lodge catalog will be buried with me.
did you get any response back or
I
anything?
didn't. I didn't. I didn't.
Oh,
I didn't really expect to, but I just so he knows that
yeah.
someone's holding on to this just to
Yeah.
make their life.
It, yeah, that's going to be with you for the rest of your life.
Oh
So
yeah,
that, yeah, that, I mean, that right there, that in and of itself is important because as artists, we tend to make things and make things and make more things. And at a certain point, like, where are all these things going to go?
yeah,
And if somebody's saying, I'm taking this to the grave,
yeah,
that's high praise.
yeah, yeah. And I think you do. You make something, and I don't sell a ton, but I've sold a little, and but you don't think about like, oh yeah, somebody's living with this. I mean, until you're like looking at other artists, like I have a painting from you, and I have a painting from Patrick, and other artists in the Cincinnati area that I've known. Yeah, there's an Andrew Aw eyeball hanging over our bed, which is possibly terrifying, but sort of great.
And
Um,
exactly where it should be.
and exactly where it should be. Um, and uh, and you live with those things and they become part of your life. And I think as artists, we can kind of forget about that, but that is kind of the, ultimate goal in some ways.
Cool. Well, Emily Ann, this has been a pleasure talking
Thank you
with
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna turn this off and then we can talk a little bit more, but I want to thank you again. It's a joy to count you as a friend and to know that we've been in the trenches together making art and we've had a lot of great experiences together. So I'm so happy that you're one of my friends.
Same here. Thank you for this opportunity. Just to be able to talk. It's been great.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Stop recording. Let's see.